Hello again, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. Welcome to my third and final post about interpersonal communication for helpers. I really have appreciated the attention that this series has received from my Winnipeg campus students. As you know, in the context of interpersonal communication, attending refers to the way that a listener physically, as well as psychologically, puts him or herself in a position to listen to and understand the speaker. And the analogy that I've tended to use is that much like an outfielder in a baseball game who stands with legs slightly bent and glove poised to catch the ball at the crack of the bat, attending prepares the listener to receive messages accurately. The attentive presence of the listener really is an invitation for the other person to enter or continue a discussion. It conveys acceptance of and respect for the other person and promotes the development of the kind of trust that permits the other person to disclose his or her concerns. You know, half-hearted attempts at attention never work, and they're really easily read by communication partners, and what they do is to convey a message of disinterest and absence of acceptance and absence of respect. Even though this may not be the intended message, the consequence may be that the speaker fails to develop trust in the listener, who then experiences reluctance to disclose or to discuss meaningful issues and concerns. To psychologically attend to the communication partner, listeners really have to prepare by consciously deciding to do a number of things. To begin, to put personal distractions and internal conversations aside for the time of the conversation. To focus on the expressed needs, themes, concerns, and core messages of the other person. To remove the interference that assumptions and preconceptions might otherwise have on accurately understanding the other's messages. And to pay attention to the thoughts, feelings, and attitudes that are conveyed through the nonverbal and verbal communication of both partners. Listen with your eyes, with your heart, with your undivided attention, as well as with your ears. When you listen to the messages that are embedded in the nonverbal cues that surround the words, you're dedicating yourself to the kind of effective listening that is so important to helping relationships. In addition to these basic guidelines, attending behaviors are communicated by these: by facial expressions that indicate interest, by voice intonations that reflect understanding of expressed emotions, and by following gestures and minimal encouragers or cues, such as head nods, brief verbal and vocal responses like yes, go on, It is important to acknowledge that people vary. Ultimately, they do vary in terms of cultural and individual ways in which they show attentiveness and react to the attentiveness of others. Because of that, the guidelines that I've just described can be adjusted and should be adjusted to account for cultural and individual differences. It does remain important, however, for each person to reflect on his or her own attending behaviors by asking, does my nonverbal behavior indicate a willingness to be involved with the other person? That's a centrally important question for you to ask of yourself in all interactions with your clients. I want to talk a little bit right now about some particular active listening responses. The attending behaviors that I've just discussed communicate the listener's interest in the speaker, and they prepare the listener to understand the speaker's communicated messages. The active listening responses that I now want to talk about with you provide feedback to the speaker to inform that person, to inform him or her of how the listener, how you have in this particular instance, understood the communication and the communicated message of the other person. In addition to simply asking questions, these responses are also the means that effective listeners use to confirm whether your understanding in this case is correct. Finally, the active listening responses that I really want to mention have the common effect of communicating interest in the other person and in that other person's story. Particular approaches that I want to talk about are these: using silence, paraphrasing, and restatement, and conveying empathy. Using silence, well, talking less. The essential goal of listening to another person is to obtain an understanding of that person's messages. As a general rule, you can be helped to understand the other person by listening more than speaking. It's been put in this way: we've been given 2 ears and but a single mouth in order that we may hear more and talk less. The other perspective to think about is simply this: as a helper, if you're talking more than 50% of the time, it's likely that you're talking too much. By being silent and by listening to the story of the other person, the listener acknowledges the importance of that person's experience. This can sometimes mean that the listener must resist the urge to tell his or her own story or to give advice. That urge is so strong in novice listeners, in novice helpers. But by putting aside these kinds of personal impulses, the listener is better equipped to understand the unique experience of the other person. Paraphrasing is a form of feedback that lets the speaker know how the listener has understood the speaker's message. When used by the listener, it gives the speaker an opportunity to confirm that the message was correctly understood, or it provides an opportunity for clarification if the message was incorrectly understood. Paraphrasing means that the listener uses his or her own words to let that speaker know how he or she has understood the message that was just sent. For example, if the speaker says something like, "Everything's changed since my injury. Friends just aren't the same anymore." And the listener might paraphrase by simply replying with something like this: "Your friends have been treating you differently since your injury." This is different from restatement. Restatement has its place, but it's a simple verbatim repetition of what the other person has said, or a portion of what the other person has said. In this particular example, an example of restatement would be, "Your friends have been treating you differently." Notice that paraphrasing is said tentatively in the form of an inquiry. This invites the speaker to confirm or to clarify or to simply reject the listener's understanding, and it encourages the speaker to continue discussing his or her concerns. The listener can also frame the paraphrase in a manner similar to this: "If I understand you correctly, your friends have been treating you differently since your spinal cord injury. Is that right?" Paraphrasing can also be used to make a direct request for more information and better understanding. For example, the listener might say, "You mentioned that your friends have been treating you differently since your spinal cord injury. Can you tell me more about that?" Listening with empathy. As you know, empathy can be described as the accurate understanding of another person's emotional state and related circumstances. An example of communicated empathy is, you were deeply hurt when your husband left you after your injury. There are 2 essential components here. You were deeply hurt refers to the emotional state experienced by the individual, and then when your husband left you after the injury refers to the circumstance. So there's that relationship that's being introduced with the empathic statement. Another example is, you feel desperately alone because people who are important to you have not visited you since your illness.